Why do 95% of attempts to orangepill fail? It's not because Bitcoin is wrong, it's because we're communicating it wrong. Daniel Batten has spent 4 years fighting the hardest FUD in Bitcoin. And in this seminar, he breaks down the exact playbook that actually works. If Bitcoin adoption matters to you, this is a must watch.
So my intention in doing this, first and foremost, is I've been doing this for almost 4 years now, and I'm not a FUD fighter or an activist. I was a technology entrepreneur and then a coach. And so I thought, well, I want to go back to doing a whole lot more coaching, because actually that's how I can have more impact on the Bitcoin community. And why not use the skill of coaching to show other people what I've been doing so that it can be replicated, because the principles that I've used absolutely can be replicated. And the first thing I want to let everyone know and give permission to do is that this is my intention, is to open source everything I'm doing, not just to say, hey, use my charts, use my techniques, use everything. As Picasso once said, good artists copy, but great artists steal. So steal my stuff, use it, feel no impunity. You can use what I've said verbatim. You don't have to quote my name even, because that might get repetitive. So if you find a message that works, just use it relentlessly. So you have total unbridled permission to do that. In terms of how I started doing this, I fell into it by accident. My backstory is I started a technology company, and I found in a hurry I had to be able to pitch my ideas, or else no one was going to invest in the companies. So I wasn't very good naturally at influencing other people, but I had to learn to become good at it in a hurry, or else our company was going to die. And I did become good at it. And we raised capital and we exited about 5 years ago. And I got so interested in the process of, because I'd been not very good at it, I became much better at it. I started to codify it so that other people could replicate some of those recipes and formulas, and wrote a book on it. And a lot of the principles that I've used in fighting Bitcoin FUD come from this book. The key principle here is that the principles I use don't work unless you're telling the truth, which is what I like about it. So it's not about spin, it's not about subterfuge, it's not about marketing, it's about telling the truth succinctly. And I trialed this on, and it's important, you know me, I like to go into the data and the receipts. The techniques I've used from the book, I've trained the CEOs of 11 science-led technology companies, helping them raise capital. And of those, these are the people who are successful. So 11 out of 11. The industry track record for deep tech companies is just under 20%. So I need to acknowledge there is a chance this could have occurred statistically as an anomaly, but that chance is roughly 0.000000178%, or 1 in 56 million. In other words, probably more likely that something that I was doing in training was working. And then I said, okay, that's been successful one field. Bitcoin's something I care about deeply. Let's use these same principles to really pitch the environmental benefits of Bitcoin. So it's not just about being defensive and counteracting FUD, it's actually doing the opposite. It's pitching the environmental benefits and using misinformation, innocent or not, as a springboard to be able to tell the real story, which can inspire people. Now, this matters a lot. And we've had a couple of people who said, look, I'm going to be doing work, I'm going to be doing advocacy, talking to politicians, talking to the community, talking to prospective investors. And I know this is going to come up. And it matters because at the moment, we have the most bullish expectation is we have still under 5% of the world uses Bitcoin. And that's the most bullish estimation. So there's a whole bunch of people who just don't use it. And our next wave of adopters includes sovereign funds, corporates, and your friends. And how you came to Bitcoin was probably doing your own research. How they are going to come to Bitcoin is not doing their own research. You and I are the outliers who do our own research. The rest of the population do not. They're not technology enthusiasts, they're not early adopters, they're not innovators, the early majority, and they need digestible messages in order to accept a new nascent technology. So that's up to us. Now, what this image here is expressing is the importance of knowing your target. You can be the most amazing archer in the world, but if you're blindfolded and you don't know where the target is, you've got a very low probability of hitting the target. So in the same way, you might be wonderful at enunciating the message. You might be inspiring. You might be a great evangelist for Bitcoin. But if you go out there and start talking to sovereign funds and politicians and ESG funds and investment committees, and you don't know their view of the world and what things they need to understand to accept Bitcoin, then you're just a great archer who's blindfold. So a lot of this comes down to, it's not just about how you enunciate a message, but it's about having the time, the humility, and the patience, frankly, to understand who your audience is and how they make decisions. And I can tell you right now that a lot of the way the Bitcoin community is engaging with corporates, with the boards of corporates, with sovereign funds, and with regulators and policymakers is very much like this picture. The great messages for Bitcoiners, but totally the wrong message for that next user community. The other reason that knowing how to counteract FUD and tell our story well is important, because FUD doesn't just affect adoption, it also affects price. And people have short memories. 2021, people say, yeah, there was a China mining ban and then Bitcoin price dropped. Well, that's true. It did drop. It dropped from 41,000 to 37,000. What they forget was that what was responsible for most of that drop was Elon Musk's FUD about Bitcoin, his environmental concerns, probably prompted by his own board of Tesla at the time, and saying we're very concerned about its environmental impact and its energy usage, and he quoted Cambridge, and that was the catalytic event that caused Bitcoin price to cascade down $17,000. So FUD affects adoption and it also affects price. So in other words, let's make the implicit explicit. The better we are at counteracting FUD, the more resilient prices and the faster adoption occurs. So it's very important. And this is the TLDR of my whole presentation. There's 4 things that are important. And this is the what, and I'm going to go through the how. The first thing is you tell the truth succinctly. Successful influence is a subtractive art. Think about it like power to weight ratio. Every single time you say anything, it has a weight because people need to digest it and understand it. And sometimes it may not justify its weight. So pitching is a subtractive art. Second, communicate to influence, not simply to inform. Humans decide emotionally and justify rationally. So you can have the most wonderful arguments and cases and logic and data in the world, and it's important that you do. However, if you haven't created an emotional connection with another person, they're not feeling safe, they're feeling not safe, they're feeling like you don't care about them, they're feeling like you're a Bitcoin maxi who just wants to evangelize, they don't feel like you care about their reality or you've taken the time to understand their perspective or meet them where they're at, doesn't matter. They're not going to hear you. They're not going to listen to you. Communicate to influence, not just to inform. Third thing is check your intention. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you getting into a debate with someone? Debates are normally ineffective. I would suggest you have conversations, not debates, and quickly qualify if you're in a debate and exit it if you are, because there's very low probability that you will change anyone's mind. So what's your intention? Do you want to get something off your chest? Do you want to communicate your frustration or exasperation? Do you want to try to defeat someone by your superior logic? Well, if that's your intention, the chances of someone changing their position about Bitcoin are very low. And in fact, the opposite is true. They're probably likely to consolidate an impression that Bitcoiners are aggressive and evangelical, and they don't want to be part of that tribe. So check your intention. Are you communicating to serve, to educate, or to express a personal frustration or belief? And the fourth thing is an unusual combination, which is absolutely compatible, which is communicate with authority, but also humility. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. So these are the 4 principles that I always check in with. And sometimes I fail. Sometimes I don't follow my own principles and I have to go back and think, okay, I'm going to delete that tweet. Oh, that wasn't quite the right way to say it. It didn't follow my own recommendations to self. Where are we today? Now, the good news is that we have made some outstanding progress over the last few years. 90% of independent reports, more than 90% of mainstream media reporting, 92% of sustainable media reporting, which is exceptional. I'll give you the resources that have this data. And more than 80% of peer-reviewed articles since the merge show strong environmental benefits to Bitcoin. So we've done some truly outstanding work. And this has been possible because of a team of honey badgers, but also people outside the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I'll give you this presentation, and each one of these is actually a link to a key event. So let's just pick one randomly. I'm going to my finger here. Okay, September 2023, Bloomberg Terminal, Jamie Coots, publishes for the first time Bitcoin ESG charts saying that Bitcoin is more than 50% sustainably powered. It was a watershed event. Another key event, when the ERCOT grid operator, Brad Jones, came out and publicly endorsed the benefit of Bitcoin accelerating the renewable energy transition. And then most recently, just this year, last year now, Cambridge University's report strongly endorsed Bitcoin's mining environmental benefits in the field of heat recycling, methane mitigation, and also saying it's more than 50% sustainably powered. So there was not one event. No, Bitcoin's environmental narrative did not change because of BlackRock. And I know because I've been watching the shift, and it happened gradually over a 4-year period. No, it did not happen because there was an influx of AI and the media got distracted and started attacking them instead. It happened because of the proof of work of a number of people inside and outside the Bitcoin ecosystem to improve the quality of research, data, reporting, and dissemination of information about Bitcoin. The principles that I use here, I use my own book, and I also use the work of Robert Cialdini, who you may have heard of. He talked about the 6 and he added a 7th principle of influence. I don't tend to use all 7. They're not all relevant, but the ones that you'll see evidence that I use a lot is social proof, unity, and authority. Social proof is people like psychologically to be part of a crowd. So when I find a media outlet which is still publishing FUD about Bitcoin, then a great thing to let them know, by the by, is you may not be aware that there have now been 22 newspapers who are now started publishing environmental pro-ESG narratives on Bitcoin. You're one of the ones who hasn't changed. So letting them know they're an outlier, they're not part of a crowd anymore. Unity. People tend to trust people who they feel are of the same tribe as them. So you'll notice in a lot of my messages to people who are antagonists to Bitcoin, I will look to see what's the thing we have in common, not what's the thing we have not in common. It's very obvious we have different perspectives, but what do we have in common? And maybe, oh, we both care about the environment. We both care about energy. We both care about whatever, but find the thing you have in common with that person and speak from that perspective. It may be that you both like scientific rigor or academic rigor or evidence-based cases. Or you both have a commitment to doing research and looking at things in a nuanced way. So highlight that. And authority. The fact that there are peer-reviewed articles, there are independent reports, 22 peer-reviewed articles, 8 independent reports that have endorsed Bitcoin's environmental benefits, you will notice that I repeat that relentlessly because that is authority. That is third parties other than me who are neutral, who are independent, who have said that Bitcoin has these merits, and people may not be aware of that. And I also use some principles from my own book. We'll talk later about how I use questions and analogies, but the 2 principles I routinely use, which have nothing to do with message, comes back to the mindset. What's your intention? We had that point earlier, and non-attachment. Let me ask you, have you ever had someone try to influence you to their perspective when you could tell they cared too much about what they were talking about and they had an attachment to changing your mind? You ever experienced that? And how does it feel when someone's too unrelenting and they have an attachment to you coming over to their side? It actually has the opposite effect. So it's important to have an intention. You want to educate that person. You want to maximize the chance that they can come to a correct understanding of Bitcoin, which is anchored in facts, not perspectives and not mythology. But also it's up to them. Realize that you don't have control over that, just like people don't have control over you. They have agency. They're totally entitled to hear everything you say and ignore it. Don't be attached to what they do with that data. You don't know. They may do nothing, but then 2 other people may talk about Bitcoin and the third person will have the impact and they'll change their perspective. But you taking that first action, you had to be the first in 3. So whether they agree with you, disagree with you, need some more time to think about it, do not be attached to the fruits of your action. Very important. It actually increases your effectiveness and influence. I use these principles a lot. When it comes to message, the meta frame that I have found most successful is rather than engage point by point on the reasons that someone's perspective is wrong, is simply to acknowledge that our impressions about Bitcoin is simply the rite of passage that all nascent disruptive technologies go through. Happened with a bicycle, happened, and I've got a presentation on that, happened with the internet, happened with the automobile, happened with radio. Every disruptive technology since the dawn of recorded, documented history was accompanied by attack, misunderstanding, and a lot of pseudoscience. Bitcoin is simply an extenuation of that pattern, with one exception. And that exception is it's the first technology where there is a direct financial cost to being late to the party. And that tends to make people who were late, who had the opportunity, even more critical. This is a rite of passage that all nascent disruptive technologies go for. Painting that with that frame allows people to say, hey, do you really want to be, it's like the implication is, do you really want to be one of those people who said that radios could cause windows to shatter and could cause birds to lose their flight paths and could cause jail breakouts, things that were actually said? Do you really want to be in the same category as people, social proof again, who said that bicycles could cause women to go insane? Do you really want to be one of those people who said that the internet was going to be no more valuable than a fax machine to humanity? Well, look, this is the way that all disruptive technologies are treated to start with. And then what happens over time is we gain more information, we get better data, we understand it more, we get over our implicit negativity bias because all humans are negative towards things they don't understand for very good evolutionary reasons that I won't get into now, but it's true. Or do you want to be someone who actually digs a little bit deeper and looks at the nuance? The implication is, what tribe do you want to be associated with? The ones on the wrong side of history or the right? But you don't even need to make it that explicit. This is the meta frame that I found very successful at just softening people up and getting them to say, oh, you're right. Yeah, okay, let me look at it through this lens. Maybe we have got some things wrong. Maybe we have misunderstood it. Now, what are some concrete things I've done over the last year? One action that I've taken, which you can take as well. It's very simple, takes very little time. You can write public letters, but even more impactful can be to write private letters. And this is an example of a letter that I wrote, which was a combination where I had a public message on X, but also found out who'd written it, wrote to the communications person at Environment America, and notified them that there was, again, and using very neutral language, that there was some, what do I say here? There is an article by Evan Jones that contains many objective falsehoods that have been debunked multiple times in reputable peer-reviewed journals. As an environmentalist, so there is the unity principle, who has spent a lot of time studying Bitcoin, I would request that you thoroughly educate yourself about Bitcoin before writing it, and that you retract this article. Okay? And they did. So again, it's a direct request. I would say 1 out of 10 requests that I get for a retraction are successful, but hey, you write 30 letters, you get 3 retractions. You write 40 letters, you get 4 retractions. And that's pretty much what happened over the last year. And even the ones that don't retract, they have a funny habit of not writing about Bitcoin again. Or sometimes they will soften their position but not retract. Sometimes they will adjust it. And sometimes they will just realize that, oh, it's no longer possible for me to believe that it's a simple binary argument of environmentalists against Bitcoin as it's not. Here are some other things that it's very important when you're, even though you're using the principle of truth, the principle of truth is not behind FUD by definition, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You will encounter spin, you will encounter dishonesty, you will encounter flawed reasons. And I've written down it's important to reject 5 things. So false frames. So what's an example of a false frame? Well, a false frame could be Bitcoin has a high carbon dioxide footprint or has a high carbon footprint. That's a false frame because do you ever hear someone say EVs have a high carbon footprint? No. What do people say about EVs? They say they're zero emission. Now, this is an apples for oranges comparison because you are comparing the direct emissions of EVs with the indirect emissions of Bitcoin. In other words, Both Bitcoin and EVs have three things in common. Number one, they have no direct emissions. They're 100% electrified. Number two, they both have indirect emissions from the underlying generation source, which in some cases was fossil fuel. And number three, both technologies obviate a more fossil fuel intensive predecessor. Fossil fuel driven transport in the case of EVs, and in the case of Bitcoin, the banking sector as a medium of exchange, and the gold industry as a store of value. So reject false frames, challenge these notions, point out that Bitcoin is in the same category as EVs, but it's only our lack of scrutiny that has allowed these implicit apples for oranges comparisons to go unchecked. So check those, challenge people on them. Reject false gold. So what's an example of a false gold? This energy expert says, well, I'm sorry, but to comment about Bitcoin, it's not enough to be an energy expert. Bitcoin mining is like bioinformatics. It is an interdisciplinary area. It requires you to have at least some knowledge of computer science, physics, energy, Bitcoin mining itself, and environmental science. If you only understand energy, you might not even have a good understanding of grids or demand response. You are unqualified to write about Bitcoin. So who is qualified to write about it? Academics who have published work on Bitcoin. They are qualified to write about it. Grid operators who have observed it firsthand. People who have studied Bitcoin mining. Now, another interesting thing is sometimes people say, well, that person's from the Bitcoin mining industry. They have a biased perspective. We should ignore them. Does anyone ever say, well, this person's a medical doctor. We should ignore their medical opinion? Oh, this person's a dentist. They're from the industry. We should ignore their opinion on dentistry? It's ludicrous. Or this person uses computers. They're biased. We should ignore their opinion about computers or the internet. Let's talk to people who have never used computers, never used the internet. So challenging these false perspectives and this implicit belief that because someone uses Bitcoin, they're biased, not realizing that because they use Bitcoin, they're qualified, and also not realizing that if you don't use Bitcoin, if you don't hold Bitcoin, you're actually even more biased because now you have the ego and self-identity confirmation bias to want to be right, to have seen Bitcoin, but to have ignored it because it was speculative, used for criminals, or fill in the blank. So we use psychologically a lot of ploys to justify our decisions that we were right, because being wrong can be painful to the ego. Avoid false categorizations. So, for example, what's an example? I can't think of one offhand. False inferences. Yeah, so the inference that because Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, it's bad for the environment. Nonsense. This is false categorization. So false categorization might be Daniel Batten, Bitcoin proponent says this, but this environmentalist says this is what environmentalists say. False categorization. Because I'm also an environmentalist. I'm a climate tech investor, and I embraced Bitcoin, not because I held Bitcoin, because I researched it as a climate tech investor and realized that it was net positive for the environment or had the potential to be. So that's a false categorization. Saying environmentalists don't like Bitcoin is also a false categorization because a lot of environmentalists love Bitcoin, and I'm one of them. Troy Koss is another. Margot Pay is another. Troy Wash is another. There's plenty of them. And not all environmentalists are against it. And not all environmentalists have a problem with energy use. In fact, most don't. Most understand that we need to use energy to accelerate the green transition. And it's only actually a subset of degrowthers and environmental activist organizations who hold the perspective that we should be using less energy, right? So that's categorization. False inference, I've covered. That's Bitcoin uses energy, therefore it's bad for the environment. Nonsense. It depends on the type of energy and whether it's flexible or not. And false intelligence. This has just come up twice in the last few weeks where people have said, hey, I've done an AI query. I asked if Bitcoin's good for the environment and look what it says. Well, guess what? This is not AI. This is FI. This is false intelligence. What I suggest you do if you want to debunk the use of AI to get opinions on Bitcoin, ask AI, where will your answers be reliable and where will they be unreliable? And AI will say, when I'm commenting on areas which are new, which are emerging, I will tend to be unreliable. And then I ask the question explicitly, will your views on Bitcoin mining be reliable or unreliable? AI said, unreliable. Why? because what it's doing is it's a fast-changing field. The data is becoming new. It's like the bicycle. If you had asked, if AI had existed back in the 1920s and you'd asked AI if radio was good for human health, AI would have said, no, it's terrible for human health. If AI had existed in the 1880s and you'd asked if bicycles were bad for women, it would have said they're terrible for women. You should avoid them. Women should not ride bikes. It makes them antisocial. It causes craziness. So AI knows enough about itself that it knows that it'll get things wrong when it comes to inference on new, novel, disruptive technologies, because all it's doing is it's taking the average of what was published on the internet over the last 6 years without knowing what's reliable and what's not. And it'll take the average. So it'll get bad data, old data, debunked studies, and all the good studies mixed into one potpourri of non-reliability. Okay, here are some things that you should never say. Some people do, but it trivializes it. So never say Bitcoin's energy use is a rounding error. Bitcoin's energy use should be celebrated. Never be defensive or use the Me Too argument. Oh yes, Bitcoin uses energy, but that's nothing compared to Christmas lights or fill in the blank or clothes dryers. You don't need to do that. And it actually makes you look defensive and like you're trying to divert attention. Yeah, sure, I might have punched him in the face, but this guy actually, he did a roundhouse kick 3 times and broke his leg. It doesn't exonerate what you do. And so people know that that is a tactic to avoid attention. You don't need to do that. And don't say things like, oh, but in order to be a Kardashev type 1 civilization, we need to use more energy. Most people don't know what a Kardashev type 1 civilization, and even if they do, they haven't necessarily bought into the thesis that more energy use is what we need to advance civilization. So you've now made accepting Bitcoin to be dependent on a belief which they may or may not share on a subject they may or may not know about. There's no need to do that. Okay, so I like to go for not defense, but 180-degree turnarounds. So rather than, now Bitcoin doesn't really waste energy or other people waste more energy, turn it around 100% and tell the truth. Failure to mine Bitcoin is what wastes energy, and point out the examples. Look at all the wasted energy in this hydro dam, on this solar farm, on this wind farm, and this nuclear facility in France. And look how Bitcoin has prevented that waste of energy, monetized it, and accelerated the green energy transition. Rather than Bitcoin raises power prices, no, it's the opposite. The failure to use Bitcoin mining raises power prices, and we have examples of that in Kenya, where they started using Bitcoin mining, prices went down 29%. In Norway, where they stopped putting Bitcoin mining on the grid, prices went up by 20%. And rather than saying that Bitcoin mining is holding back the energy transition, say it's the other way around. We have peer-reviewed research to say that it accelerates the green energy transition. So 180s, not defenses, has always been part of my philosophy. When you are responding to FUD, do triage. So what this means is if you're in a war zone and you're having to do surgery, you have to make a decision. Okay, a whole lot of people have come. It's a war zone. I don't have time to do the eloquent surgery that I would normally do, the elaborate surgery I might do in my private clinic. This is a war zone. So I need to do triage. That means who's going to survive even if I don't do surgery? Okay, they don't get it. They don't get attention. Who's going to die even if I do surgery? They're not going to get my attention. Who is probably going to die if they don't get surgery, but they will survive if they do? Those are the ones that I'll prioritize, and you let them in. So in the same way, prioritize, do triage. Is this someone I'm going to fight with? Am I going to fight? Am I going to ignore? Am I going to educate? And the way to decide, generally you don't want to fight. The only time you want to fight is if someone like Bill Mayer or whoever manages the account puts out some absolute nonsense about Bitcoin. You know Bill Mayer is never going to read it, but you want to let it be known that if people are going to put out nonsense, they will be held to account. And so you have a strong counter message which doesn't attack the person, but it does attack their logic. And that's a key distinction. Never attack the person, but you may attack their logic. Second, do you want to ignore it? Will this be the Streisand effect? Will it not get that much attention if you ignore it? So the best thing is to ignore it. Or the third category, is it an opportunity for you to educate? And as much as possible, I like to spend 80% of my time in the educate category. And here's an example. So this is a true story. This is a guy who was a wholesale investor into our climate tech fund. back in 2022, and we were having a coffee at this particular cafe, which you see in the background, which is in Auckland, New Zealand on Mount Eden Road. I think it's called the Garden Shed. Yeah, that's right. And I was waiting for his wife to arrive as well. So we were just shooting the breeze. And he said, hey, what are you up to at the moment? And I said, well, I'm actually doing some research on Bitcoin mining. We're looking into whether we get involved in our fund. And his whole body language changed. Remember, this is 2022. He stiffened, he folded his arms, and he said, I thought you were interested in doing things that were good for the environment. And I said, well, it sounds like you've got some things you've heard about Bitcoin. Let's hear what they are. And he told me. And I said, well, and he told me the usual uses too much energy. It takes energy away from other people. I can't remember the third one. And I said, look, I can understand why you'd say that. I've been an environmental campaigner across 4 decades. And I had a very similar view when I first encountered Bitcoin. But upon studying it more deeply, I found that it's a technology that is already promoting social and economic justice at a scale. Would you like to hear a little of what I found out? And his whole body language changed. He unfolded his arms, he took a breath out, and he said, yeah, sure, go ahead. That framing was as important as the logic that I said next. Because if I hadn't said that, we would have been in a debate. I didn't assume he wanted to hear what I had to say. I showed empathy from the start. I can understand why you'd say that. I showed authority. I've been an environmental campaigner over 4 decades, but also some empathy because I knew he had strong environmental and social values as well. And I asked a question rather than assuming, do you want to hear what I find out? If he said no, I would have left it at that. I'm not attached to changing his perspective. And then I just proceeded to say, okay, I heard you say 3 things. Let me make sure you got it right. You said this, this, and this. Is that correct? He said, yes. Okay, here's what I found out about this. Here's what I found out about this. Here's what I found out about this. 10 minutes later, you wouldn't believe what he said. He said, have you considered your next fund being a Bitcoin mining investment fund? So yes, this approach works. The combination of empathy, speaking to the emotions, not only the logic, is essential, and it is possible, even with real skeptics, to have 180-degree shifts in their attention and their beliefs. Okay, framing is important. When people quote De Vries, one of the chief architects of Bitcoin, the chief, patient zero, in fact, for misinformation on Bitcoin, I simply say, well, are you aware that this source you quote, De Vries, had his work debunked in total in a 2024 study? And then pause. Oh, I wasn't. Yeah, and did you also know that since that, the media is no longer referencing his work on Bitcoin mining? That's all you need to say. Are you aware that? It's a very powerful frame, and it's a question. Questions tend to be more powerful than statements. Here are 2 of the principles from my own book that I use. I use a lot of analogies. Why? Because grids are complex things. People don't always understand them. Trying to get people to understand the price dynamics of Bitcoin and demand response and wholesale responsiveness to price signals may take a long time. And in the meantime, people's eyes have glazed over. But if I simply say, no one would say that ants take away foods from humans. Why? Because they eat wasted food that either humans cannot use because they're crumbs, or they're a food source that isn't attractive to humans. Bitcoin is the same. Bitcoin mining uses surplus energy at times of day that solar can't use it in the middle of the day or in the middle of the night, surplus wind that otherwise no one would use. It's wasted energy. Or it's at a place where people can't use it because it's too far away and it cannot be transported. It provides a vital service to the grid. It stabilizes it, uses wasted energy. It takes energy away from no one, and it accelerates the renewable energy transition because it provides that renewable operator with money they otherwise wouldn't get. And what do they do with that money? They do what any prudent business operator would do. They plow it back into expanding their operation, which means more solar, more wind on the grid. I haven't had to talk about hertz or frequencies or demand response or FCAS or 4CA or any acronyms that people wouldn't understand. Analogies. And I've got some examples here of where I've been in podcasts when I've used these analogies. And questions. Would you value the opinion of a financial analyst who went into a business, only measured the expense column and concluded the business was in bad shape? No, you wouldn't. Okay. So in the same way, would you value an analyst who had only examined the negative externalities of Bitcoin, hadn't looked at the positive, and had made their conclusion based on that ledger item only? Okay. So it's a bit of analogy, but a question here. Would you rely on election predictions that use poll data from 2021? No, of course not. Well, why would you trust a study that used Bitcoin data from 2021? They're both dynamic systems. In fact, the Bitcoin system has changed more than polling data has. So using questions is going to be very effective, much more than statements. When it comes to other FUD, use the same principles. 180 is not defense. It's the other way around. Here's some great examples. I myself steal things from other people. When people say it's a bubble, there is no better response than what Lynn Alden said, I think about 1.5 years ago. At what point do people stop comparing a 3-year bubble to a 15-year structural adoption pattern? Sometimes a picture tells 1,000 words. Does that look like a bubble? No. This is my own using the principles Lynn Alden used with a Ponzi. And this is a simple message I put together, which again just explains it visually. It's a nice visual. Again, you're not defending Bitcoin from, no, Bitcoin's not a Ponzi. You say, well, Bitcoin is actually probably the first form of currency we've had for a long time that's not a Ponzi. The only thing I'd change here, I wouldn't say backed by energy. That's not technically correct. I'd say secured by energy, but otherwise that's pretty accurate. And when it comes to criminals, there's a couple of things you can do. You can alert people to say, okay, why don't you meet some of the people you've just called criminals? Show them pictures of people in Africa, of women in Afghanistan, right? Of people queuing up in a bank in Lebanon, because without Bitcoin, they couldn't have get access to those are the ones who got their savings eroded away, but others didn't. So why don't you meet some of the people you just called criminals? Now, here's another example, is just counter it with fact. This is a tweet that I did where Gary Gensler signaled that, the leading market share in ransomware is Bitcoin. What he didn't say that less than 0.1% of all cybercrime was ransomware. And I just had a tweet pointing that out with the data and with a simple chart, which had the slither, which was ransomware, and the very large portion, which was not. I've got a link to the original tweet so you can see the graphic. When people say that it's useless, now, you note here it says this post was deleted by the post author. Quite often I find that as long as I'm neutral and I don't attack the OP, people actually retract the original posts without being requested. And this is one of my favorite, and you can just copy and paste this one. When you say it's useless, you're welcome to your opinion. When you're saying that it's useless, what you were saying is helping bring energy abundance to 1,800 African villages has no value. Getting aid to thousands of war refugees has useless. Developing energy and independence in Bhutan is useless. So you're letting people know the consequence of what you're saying. You're not calling them names, but you're pointing out the logical extrapolation of what they've just said with a lot of receipts, all from, for the most part, mainstream media. So I'm going to take questions now. We've gone just a little bit past the half hour I said we'd do. There's some resources you can use that I think you'll find really useful. Here are some things you can do. This is what I've done routinely. Do a daily search on these terms: Bitcoin environment, Bitcoin energy, Bitcoin sustainable, Bitcoin renewable, Bitcoin mining. Write letters, public and private letters to people, because they do change perspectives, opinions, and they change the narrative. Steal, copy, reuse my stuff. And take imperfect actions regularly. Don't wait till you've got the perfect reply. The way you get better at stuff is by taking imperfect action and then reflecting on it, getting something out there. Use social media or your friends as practice, but just get in the habit of practicing your message and then reflecting on it afterwards. And ask for amplification. You can ask me, you can ask other people, say, hey, look, I've just found some FUD, I've counteracted it. Can you retweet it? And I'll probably say one of two things, either yes, or I might say, well, I can't retweet it in the current form because you've kind of attacked the person or you've said something factually incorrect. So the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to learn. And you say, okay, I'll delete that tweet, I'll redo it. And say, okay, now it's in a state I can retweet it, but you also learn something more about the principles. And innovate. Take what I've done and take it further. There's a whole lot of stuff that I and other people haven't done. We haven't yet really engaged a lot with non-Bitcoiners. So innovate. Take it to communities of people that we haven't reached out to yet and share this perspective. Remember, tell the truth succinctly, communicate to influence, check your intention, and combine humility with authority.